They say money can't buy happiness, but in Greenwich, Connecticut, it sure can buy a hell of a funeral. My name's Caleb, and as I stood there, under a black umbrella that had a broken spoke, watching the mahogany casket of my father, Arthur Sterling, lower into the frozen earth, I realized I was the only person crying. Around me, 50 people in $5,000 suits were checking their watches. They weren't mourning a man. They were waiting for a market update. My stepbrother, Julian, and my stepsister, Brooke, stood 10 feet away. They looked like they'd stepped off the cover of a high-fashion magazine. Not a hair out of place, not a single tear smudging Brooke's perfect mascara. Julian leaned over to Brooke, loud enough for me to hear, and whispered, "God, this is taking forever. I have a tea time at 4. Brooke didn't even look at him. She just adjusted her pearls and said, "Just focus on the will, Julian. That's the only part of this that matters." I'm a middle school history teacher. I live in a one-bedroom apartment in Queens where the walls are so thin I can hear my neighbor's microwave. I drive a car that makes a sound like a dying cat every time I turn left. To my father's new family, I wasn't a brother, I was an embarrassment. After the service, as the crowd began to thin and head toward the fleet of waiting black town cars, Julian stepped into my path. He pulled a silver key fob from his pocket and pressed it into my palm. I looked down. It was for his Porsche. "Hey, Caleb," he said, flashing that shark-like smile that had made him the most hated man on Wall Street. "The valet is backed up. Be a pal and pull my car around. Try not to get the seats wet with that cheap raincoat of yours." Brooke walked up behind him, her heels clicking on the wet pavement like a death march. She looked at my pilled sweater, my scuffed shoes, and then she laughed. "Oh, Julian, don't be cruel," she said. "Caleb isn't the help. He's just geographically challenged. He's forgotten where he belongs." She leaned in close, the scent of her expensive perfume making my head ache. "You don't belong here, Caleb. You never did. Once the lawyers finish their coffee tomorrow morning, you're going back to your little classroom, and we are going to forget you ever existed." I gripped the keys so hard, the plastic dug into my skin. I wanted to swing. I wanted to scream. But then I remembered. I remembered my father's hand, thin as parchment, grabbing my wrist in the hospital 2 days before he died. He was too weak to speak clearly. His eyes were clouded, but he pulled me close. He whispered one sentence, just one. "The time is always right, Caleb. You just have to look behind the face." At the time, I thought it was the delirium. I thought the cancer had finally taken his mind. "I've got the car, Julian," I said, my voice as cold as the rain. "Enjoy your afternoon, because tomorrow the time might not be so friendly." Julian just snorted and walked away. "History teachers," he muttered, "always talking in riddles because they can't afford the truth." The following morning, the air in the Sterling estate was thick with the smell of old money and fresh greed. The library was massive, floor-to-ceiling books that no one actually read, a fireplace large enough to roast a stag, and a long mahogany table where the family lawyer, Mr. Henderson, sat with a thick stack of papers. Brooke and Julian sat on the velvet sofa, looking like they already owned the world. They were whispering about restructuring the firm and which of our father's charities they were going to cut first. I sat in a wooden chair in the corner, invisible. Henderson cleared his throat. "Shall we begin?" For 45 minutes, it was a slaughter. To my daughter Brooke, I leave the Manhattan penthouse, the Hamptons estate, and 40% of Sterling Logistics. Brooke didn't even smile. She just nodded, like she was receiving a Starbucks order. To my son Julian, I leave the primary residence here in Greenwich, the private jet, and 40% of the company. Julian leaned back, crossing his legs. "Fair enough," he drawled. Then Henderson paused. He looked at me. There was a look in his eyes, something between pity and confusion. And to my eldest son, Caleb. Julian let out a loud, theatrical sigh. "Here we go. Give him the 10 grand and let's get to lunch." Henderson cleared his throat again. To Caleb, I leave the antique grandfather clock currently standing in the west hallway. The silence that followed was absolute, and then the library exploded. Julian fell back against the sofa, howling with laughter. "A clock," he laughed. "He gave you a broken wooden piece of junk." Brooke was smirking, her eyes dancing with malice. "Oh, Julian, it's perfect. It's just like you. Old, useless, and it doesn't even work." Henderson looked down at the paper. "There is no cash bequest for Caleb, no stock, no property." Julian stood up, walking over to me. He looked down, his face inches from mine. "You have 24 hours to get that eyesore out of my house. If it's still here by noon tomorrow, I'm putting it in the wood chipper." He leaned in, his voice a hiss. "You're nothing, kid. You're a footnote. Now get out of my library. I have an empire to run." I stood up. My legs felt like lead, but my head was clear. "Behind the face," I whispered to myself. "What was that?" Brooke snapped. "Nothing," I said, looking at the two of them. "I'll take the clock, but I'm going to need a truck. It's heavier than it looks." I walked out of that room, past the portraits of my ancestors, and stood in front of the clock. It was 7 feet tall, dark cherry wood, the face was tarnished gold, the hands frozen at 12:05. It hadn't ticked in 20 years. To anyone else, it was trash. To Julian and Brooke, it was a joke. But as I ran my hand along the side of the casing, I felt a small, jagged notch in the wood, a notch that shouldn't have been there. And I realized my father wasn't a sentimental man. He was a calculator. He didn't leave me a piece of furniture, he left me a weapon. It took me 3 hours and 2 very grumpy neighbors to drag that 7-foot monster up 4 flights of stairs to my apartment in Queens. By the time I pushed it into the corner of my living room, which, let's be honest, was basically my kitchen and my bedroom too, I was covered in dust and sweat. The clock looked ridiculous. In the Greenwich mansion, it looked like a piece of history. In my studio apartment, next to my second-hand sofa and a pile of ungraded history papers, it looked like a funeral monument. I sat on the floor, breathing hard, staring at the golden face of the clock. 12:05. It was frozen. The pendulum was still. The wood was cold. Suddenly, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a FaceTime call from Julian. I almost didn't pick up, but I knew if I didn't, he'd just keep calling to gloat. I swiped the screen. Julian was sitting on the terrace of the mansion, a glass of champagne in his hand. The sun was setting over the Long Island Sound behind him. "Hey, little brother," he drawled, his voice dripping with fake concern. "Just checking in. Did you get your inheritance home safely, or did it fall off the back of your rusty truck?" In the background, I could hear Brooke laughing. "Julian, stop. He probably had to sell his TV just to pay the movers." I looked at the camera, and then back at the clock. "It's fine, Julian," I said, my voice tight. "It's exactly where it belongs." "Good," Julian snapped, his smile disappearing. "The locks are changed here. Don't bother coming back for your sentimental trinkets. Your life in Greenwich is officially over. Enjoy your new roommate. I hope you like the sound of nothing." The screen went black. I tossed the phone on the sofa. The silence in the room felt heavy, suffocating. I'm a history teacher. I spend my days talking about empires that fell not because of massive wars, but because of one tiny mistake, one detail that everyone overlooked. I stood up and grabbed my toolkit. "Behind the face," I whispered. I opened the glass casing. The smell of old oil and aged wood hit me. It was a scent I remembered from my childhood, the smell of my father's study before he became the machine. I began to examine the gears. I'm not a clockmaker, but I know how things fit together. And as I looked at the internal mechanism, I realized something was wrong. Grandfather clocks from the 1800s usually have a very specific weight system, but these weights, they weren't balanced. The pendulum was jammed, not by rust, but by a piece of steel that looked brand new. This wasn't an antique failure. This was a mechanical lock. I remembered the clue again. The time is always right. What time? I tried 12:05, nothing. I tried the time of my mother's death, nothing. Then I stopped. I looked at the date on my phone, October 24th, my father's birthday. I reached in, my fingers trembling, and I manually turned the heavy golden hands, 10, 20, 30. I set the hour hand to 10 and the minute hand to 24. For a second, nothing happened. Then, from deep inside the cherry wood, I heard a sound. Click. It wasn't a soft sound, it was heavy, purposeful. The base of the clock, a solid block of wood that I thought was just for stability, slid forward 3 inches. I knelt down, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would burst. I pulled the wooden panel away. Inside was a velvet-lined